This session would be moderated by Mr. Pradeep Singh Mehta. Please, let's welcome our moderator for the session, Mr. Pradeep Singh Mehta. He is Secretary General of Consumer Unity and Trust Society, CU, COTS, India. We have distinguished panelists as well with us who are going to share insights on their experiences on the topic. In the first, we have Dr. Matina Joshi Baidya, Joint Secretary, Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Development, Government of Nepal. Yes, ma'am. Welcome, ma'am. Let's welcome another panelist for the session, Dr. Pulasthi Amarsinge, Research Fellow, Institute for Policy Studies of Sri Lanka, IPS Sri Lanka. Ms. Salini Gupta, she is with Integrated Development Studies, IIDS, Nepal. We have with us Mr. Sudeep Bajracharya, Technical Advisor, Mandala AgriFest, Nepal. Sorry. With this, I would like to hand over the stage to our moderator, Mr. Pradeep Singh Mehta. Sir, please.
Let me begin by thanking Swati for having invited me here and to moderate this session, which is an extremely relevant session considering the kind of climate change which is happening and how agriculture can be adapted. So it's mainly a sort of issue of adaptation. The issues have been, I think, are very well known, but even if you are not very familiar with these issues, I'm sure the excellent panelists that I have will be able to speak about it in a manner that we can look at something which is forward-looking. You know, let's talk about solutions. We know about the problems. And how can we take it forward, both at the national level, at the local level, and at the regional level as well. There are many lessons which can be shared by the other countries in the global south, because most of them face very similar problems. On this particular topic, we have done work in East Africa and seen as to how agriculture practices have to be changed to be able to adapt to the changing climate system. And what we found very interesting was, and this is sort of the policy aspect of it, which again you'll have to deal with. Matina, you are the government, and so you'll appreciate that. Quite often we talk about trade as a basic issue surrounding climate change and food security, which is what has been also spoken about in terms of how countries respond to food issues in their own countries. When there is a shortage, they impose export bans and so on and so forth, which is what the organizers have highlighted in the background note which has been circulated. But more importantly, what we have seen is whether the relevant ministries are able to talk to each other at all or not. Whether it is the Environment and Climate Change Ministry, or the Agriculture Ministry, or the Trade Ministry. Now these three, quite often, you know, there's a kind of a miss in terms of the policy situation. So there's always often a siloed approach, and that siloed approach doesn't, give us solutions. You all talk in terms of in compartments, and that is not very helpful. But having said that, what we did find was that we were able to bring in many ministries on the same table in order to talk about a very critical issue, which is only going to become more and more critical as you might have heard in the plenary session just now, moderated by my dear friend Ratnakar, as to what is the kind of future. The future is very, very dull, very dim, I would say, very abysmal, because I don't think that the international community is well seized of the kind of problems or the kind of changes that are going to happen to life systems totally, not just people, but agriculture, animals, and so on and so forth. Now, given the kind of changes which are going to happen, I mean, human beings are fairly resilient in the sense that they always are able to, innovate and to deal with many of these issues. But in this fast-changing world, much better response, especially at the community level when you deal with agriculture. I'm sure the speakers are going to touch upon it. Now, one of the things which we have done in India is something which is worthy of noting, is that we are shifting to climate-friendly crops, millets, for example. These require less rains and less kind of care than what would be required by wheat and rice, for example. Which means you'll have to also then change the consumption patterns simultaneously. People must be used to eating millets rather than to eat wheat. So, I mean, this is one example. There could be many other examples that one could think of. But the fact is that adaptation would be the way forward. And for that, we require various branches of the government to talk to each other, as well as with the communities and the civil society which is engaged in this kind of discussion from time to time. Having said that, let me now turn to the panel. Now, we have sufficient amount of time to speak, but what I would like is if you can make it as interactive as possible, which means you highlight a few issues which you think are important for the audience to respond to, or even other panelists respond to. And then it becomes a little more interesting and a little more generative, I would say. And I'm sure we'll be able to give the organizers a very good outcome document from this particular panel, which can be taken forward not only as a national or regional, but even including a global outlook as to how countries should deal with this kind of system. Having, again, let me reiterate that things are going to change radically. And if things are going to change radically, how do we need to have a radical thinking also in order to approach these kind of problems. Now, let me come to the panel. Matina Joshi Vaidya, Joint Secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Development of the Government of Nepal. She's a food scientist and not a civil servant in that sense, not an administrative person. So I'm sure she will share with us her own good, sound understanding about the technicalities of agricultural systems in the context of the changing climate. May I request you to speak for 7 to 8 minutes? And if you like, you could, just make some high headlines in order for other panelists and the audience to respond to, if it is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mehta. And firstly, I would like to thank the organizer, SAES, and the co-organizers. Mountainous country, and the problem is even difficult for us because that due to the temperature, rise in the temperature of the global rising warming up thing, because these Himalayas glacier are melting. Glacier is melting down, and recently in August there was a flooding happening in the Solukhumbu area nearby Sagarmatha area, Solukhumbu district of Thame, where this flooding has caused heavy loss in the economic loss there, and because of and it was figured out that later on that it is due to the climate change, and the temperature rose to 15 degrees centigrade, which the normal temperature for at that place is normally below 9 degrees centigrade. So that very day, the temperature rose to 15 degrees centigrade, and the whole village was swamped away. And again, on the late September this year, Kathmandu and the nearby districts and the whole Nepal was flooded. And there was a mudslide, and this thing has caused more than 300 deaths, and more than 50 people are still missing. And the property damage is estimated to be Nepali rupees 17 billion, which is a great amount for the country like us. So this climate change has a greater impact. But being a least developed country, we don't have system to how to say that, collect the evidence so we can claim for the loss and damage. In the COP29, there was a huge discussion on these least developed countries have not been able to claim the climate fund, you know, on the basis of the climate justice, because these temperature raise for the global warming, countries, our country, Nepal, has not contributed much. That the greenhouse gas emission is emitted by mostly the industrialized countries, and the oil producing fuel, the fossil fuel producing countries are responsible. And these funds are also very much not accessible for us. And it takes a very long time to get into that fund. And it is estimated that in a national adaptation plan that what we are talking about. So how to cope with that climate change is we need to we have a national adaptation plan has been developed, and it is estimated that 11.2 billion US dollar is required. But that's a huge amount of money, and we haven't been able to get the fund, and the very small amount of fund are we are getting, and then especially.
Can I request you to come to agriculture?
Yes. So I'm coming back here because that yes,
these
climate
issues we've discussed.
Yes, and the economic loss is mostly in the agriculture areas, and the weather is not being predictable anymore, because sometimes we have a drought and sometimes very heavy rainfall. And also because of the rise in the temperature, there is also the diseases of the plant disease, and the animal diseases are also outbreaking. Like last year, we have had in 2023, lumpy skin disease was epidemic. This thing happened, and that killed about 50,000 cattle, both cow and buffalo in Nepal. And I'm coming to the point, yes, because these diseases.
Animal husbandry is a part of agriculture.
Yes, part of agriculture, and also the bird flu, because poultry sector is one of the industrial area for us. And the bird flu is also, outbreak has been happening for last decades, and it has also greater impact on the economic loss also. And these lumpy skin diseases, because these are the transbound, so there are some of the, and other countries also, we don't have much, because we are landlocked, and that's also one of the, conditions that is also causing these kind of things. So with this, food insecurity is very high. Nepal is still the 76.4% of people are food insecure, with Nepal ranking 69th in global hunger index.
69.
Yes, 69th. But the ban on the sometimes the food grains to protect the domestic productions also affects Nepal's food security thing, because with a ban on some of the like rice, sometimes the wheat, that also raises the price here, and also inflation of the price, and also availability is also difficult. So
would you like to wind up?
Yes, later on I will join again.
Thank you.
Yes, okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vaidya. I think you made some very important points, particularly highlighting the kind of situation which Nepal is in, and being dependent on India by and large, and I think to some extent China as well?
Not much.
Not much, okay. Anyway, the important point which you made about this, among the many important points, one was very interesting, was this spread of animal disease, lumpy skin, for example. Now, is it due to physical contact, or does it transmit through air? Physical only, I see. Right. So there is cattle smuggling going on.
Yes, of course.
And that then, has this kind of problem. Though, mind you, I mean, whether it's climate change or many other atmospheric issues, they don't need a visa. they cross boundary at the whale. Having said that, let me now turn to Dr. Amarasinghe, Research Fellow, Institute for Policy Studies of Sri Lanka. About 7 to 8 minutes.
Yeah.
And some highlights, if you could, like the way Dr. Vaidya set a very good precedent.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you for inviting me to talk on this very important topic. Most of my experience will come from Sri Lanka, but I'm sure they are going to be quite relevant to the region as well. So let me slightly change the outcome to a more relevant, not more relevant, but a slightly different one. It's nutritional security. So going from food to nutritional security, because this is one of the major concerns in Sri Lanka. And I'll try to talk about how climate change and certain events have exacerbated the issue of nutritional security in Sri Lanka. So in the Sri Lankan context, of course, as you all know, we had this huge economic crisis, and people have moved away from these a diet that focuses more on the quantity than the quality, meaning that they focus on these getting the energy intake instead of the micronutrients and macronutrients. And in terms of climate, climate change has been a huge obstacle in getting back the previous types of dietary habits that people have had, simply because the food systems or the current food system is unable to make nutritious diets affordable, accessible, available, and also desirable. The desirability was there even before the economic crisis, but the other factors, affordability, accessibility, availability, as we all know, that's going to be affected by climate change. So as everyone here knows, climate change, the rise in temperatures, that's predicted to affect most of the South Asian region and most of the low-income countries in terms of agricultural production. It's also, the CO2 emissions are also predicted to reduce the quality of foods, meaning that it facilitates faster growth in C3 types of crops, but it reduces the micronutrient composition of certain types of important crops in the region. So these all contribute to this idea of hidden hunger in the region. So hidden hunger meaning that so communities are not able to get the sufficient amount of essential micronutrients and proteins. So you can see that there's a clear link between climate change and food and nutritional security. And in the Sri Lankan context, this is challenging because I'll highlight three specific instances where we have had difficulties in this year alone. So recently, we have had a huge shortage in rice. Right, so rice is the staple food of Sri Lanka. We have had a huge shortage, leading to very, very high prices. So before the economic crisis, the 1 kg of rice that was around 90 rupees. Now it's after the crisis, it went around to close to 200. Now it's up to 260 in the last few months. One reason is the heavy floods, heavy droughts. Heavy floods and heavy rainfall affecting the paddy cultivation in certain areas, important areas of the country. So this climate variability has a huge effect. In 2023, there was a dry period. And this has another effect on a very important crop in Sri Lanka, and that's coconuts. Because coconuts are quite reliant on water. So right now, coconut that used to be 60 rupees has gone up to 230 rupees. That's a huge jump, right? So these are, of course, other factors like fertilizer issues, the exchange rate, affecting the fertilizer, animal problems. Those also exacerbate, these issues in agriculture. But climate change issues, whether it's droughts, so we have in Sri Lanka, we have this huge issue of uncertainty when it comes to the type of the shock, the magnitude, and the location, or in all three dimensions. So these different types of crops are being affected. The last example I have is within this year, we have, since due to high rainfall, we have had shortages of vegetables. And this is a major concern because nutritional security involves, to a certain extent, dietary diversification, right? And following the economic crisis, we have had households reducing the number of, let's say, vegetables or proteins that they take in their meals. And this sort of effect, where vegetables are less accessible, affordable, has basically made things worse. Right? So households simply aren't able to catch up or get back to the same level, and this shows. I mean, the accessibility and affordability concerns are probably the most important drivers of Sri Lanka, of the Sri Lankan household not being able to get back to the initial level of uh, nutritional security that they had. Not that they had a complete level of nutritional security, but they were quite well off in that area because of the various sources of food we have. And this actually raises kind of the next point I want to make is how do we interlink, because nutritional security eventually leads to health outcomes, right? So poor health outcomes. So how do we link these recognized linkages between agriculture, nutrition, and health? So this is key, right? So right now in the Sri Lankan system, as you said, Ms. Mehta, so some of these relevant organizations are working by themselves, right? So agriculture, health, these are all relevant organizations in pushing nutrition-specific and nutrition-sensitive policies. But right now, there's not a lot of coordination, which of course, affects the inefficiency, creates inefficiency. So, coordination in that front and recognizing that these are interlinked, that should be a major priority for the Sri Lankan economy, and I'm sure the region as well, to make sure that there is linkages existing in here. In the governance system, yes. And to make sure that food systems coming from the producers all the way to the consumers are aware of these nutritional deficiencies, nutritional needs of the country. So recently at IPS, at our institution, so some of our researchers have worked with farmers to deliver information on vegetable prices. So a mobile app to deliver vegetable prices. So they have better access to these markets. So they are aware of these shortages or the prices. So they can capitalize on whatever they, the agricultural decisions they can make. So I think these sort of small interventions, because we are financially, we're cash strapped, basically. So finding these small interventions to, address this nutritional sensitivity at different sectors should be a key policy going forward for Sri Lanka. And
in any country.
In any country, yes.
India suffers from very high level of nutrition deficiency.
Exactly. Right. So,
but I'll come to that later on. Please carry on. And would you like to conclude?
Yeah, I'll conclude here.
No, one point which you didn't raise in terms of protein deficiency, and something Sri Lanka is well endowed with fish.
Fish, yeah. So yeah. So
how come you missed that?
So the fish, so the climate effect is happening. So can I take a minute to explain about the fish? So fish, as you know, the fish, wild fish populations are predicted to move up north due to climate change. The Sri Lankan economy right now has Sri Lankan health systems have a huge problem with anemia and iron deficiency. And right now the value chains or supply chains or value chains when it comes to fish, I mean, there's a lot to be improved there from, providing fishermen or making energy systems more accessible to fishermen so they can engage in terms of, the petrol, basically.
Or the fossil fuel.
Fossil fuel systems are, looking at waste.
Is there a problem?
So that's a huge problem in Sri Lanka, that fishermen aren't able to, get the boats going. So that's been a...
They can't use sailboats.
They can't, I mean, they...
to avoid for efficient fishing.
Yeah, efficient fishing, yeah. So,
that could be for luxury fishing.
It is, but especially after the economic crisis, this was quite an issue because the access to any sort of fuel to run the motors, it was an issue.
But why does Sri Lankan government keep on seizing Indian fishermen?
So I think that's
Pakistan does it, Sri Lanka does it.
Yes, that's more of a political
anyway,
right?
I mean, India also suffers from a high level of nutritional deficiency. India, of course, is a very peculiar country, the most sui generis. We have a first world, second world, third world, fourth world, and fifth world in our country, right? So we have a larger poor population than any other country combined in the South Asian region. And nutritional deficiency is very high, honestly. The government is trying to, through midday meal schemes, at least, pulses, lentils, they're trying to feed, because not a large population is still vegetarian. And of course, they're also, putting in eggs into the system. Egg production is quite high in India, fortunately.
Yeah, it's the opposite in Sri Lanka, actually.
Yeah, right. Anyway, may I come to Shalini? Policy, can you put off your mic? Oh, sorry.
I would like to first off thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak at this platform. I would like to first give some context about the prevalence of undernourishment in South Asia, and then talk about how Nepal, because it's so import dependent, how climate smart agriculture is crucial for it as a strategy to be forward looking and address this food security issue in the future as well. So talking about undernourishment, the Food and Agriculture Organization's flagship publication, The State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World 2024, reports the prevalence of undernourishment to have sharply increased from 2019 to 2021 and has persisted at the level of 9.1% globally, meaning 733 million people are estimated to be undernourished. And South Asia has a disproportionately larger share of undernourished people at 13.9%. Similarly, the extent of moderate and severe food insecurity in South Asia was 41.1% in 2023. These are very high numbers. And given the context of trade restrictions that we've seen recently, the issues of food security are only being exacerbated. A 2023 study by David Laborde and Abdullah Mamun has shown, like they've tracked the multiple episodes of food price crisis in the world, like the 2006-8 and the 2010-11 food price crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic in 2021 and 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the various trade policy measures by exporting countries motivated to lower their own domestic prices and appease consumers in the short term also exacerbated the global crisis, as the collective actions of major exporting countries heavily distorted world prices. Global trade became increasingly restricted by either export bans, taxes, or licensing, and in a quick succession, the number of countries imposing the export restrictions rose sharply, producing a cascading effect. Most often, key cereal products such as wheat, rice, and maize, and vegetable oil products that came under different forms of export restrictions, and the main staples for many poor people in net food importing countries were constrained. So, given this context of unreliable international trade, food security concerns are very major issues even in Nepal. Nepal has been swiftly turning into a remittance-dependent economy that fulfills its consumption needs, including in agri-food from imports to a large extent. Climate-induced vulnerabilities to agriculture, food insecurity, and low income from agriculture are important causes for high labor migration from Nepal. Migration directly impacts the availability of household farm labor in agriculture, and we have also recently seen shifts in consumption patterns in Nepal, like from indigenous crops like millet and buckwheat to rice from Tarai regions. So, and if we look at the government policies to commercialize agriculture, there's very little focus on sustainable agriculture, and the indigenous practices like crop rotation, intercropping, integrated farming with crop and livestock components, use of organic manure, and traditional practices that have been practiced in Nepal have only seen little bit of focus in climate smart agriculture practices that are being promoted through various policies. the National Climate Change Survey of Nepal of 2022 reported that the pests and diseases had led to economic losses of 67.4% in the surveyed households, and hailstorms, drought, and inundation were also major causes of losses in agri-food sector. Crop diseases in the last 25 years had increased prevalence, especially in the Sudur Pashchim hill regions. So this makes prioritization of adoption of sustainable agriculture practices in the government policies all the more urgent. I would like to give a small case of the climate smart village approach that that Nepal has adopted recently and which can be seen as a successful case study in this regard. So Climate Smart Village is an organized approach to designing location-specific package of interventions in response to climatic and other ongoing changes in the agriculture system. This started around 2000s, and it was first started by like international organizations and not through the government specifically. So with the leadership of the CGI research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security, they implemented the climate smart village approach in around 20 countries, and they prioritized testing and piloting technological innovations while simultaneously devising institutional and policy innovations. They included the local communities in co-developing the CSA technologies at the community level. For example, indigenous practices such as mixed crop and livestock farming, intercropping, encouraging biopesticides and biofertilizers, use of homestead garden, all of these that were prevalent in Nepal also gained prominence in these climate smart village approach. Horizontal scaling is when the CSV sites served as demonstration sites for farmer-to-farmer learning, and vertical scaling when the CSV programs influence the policymakers and funding agencies and implementing organizations. These were all observed in the case of Nepal. Under the Climate Smart Village program, the traditional top-down bureaucratic approach was transformed to a more participatory and collaborative approach. And following this initial success, Nepal's agriculture development policies and plans began incorporating CSV as one of the climate adaptation policy objectives. It gained increasing the resilience of Nepal's farmers. The 2014 Agriculture Development Strategy also had a strong focus on promoting CSA, and Climate Smart Village concept became a part of Nepal's policies for adapting to climate change. So that is one important case, and I'd like to close here for now.
Thank you very much, Shalini. That was well within time. I must congratulate you for that. And particularly your last example that you quoted about climate smart villages, and you said that it is being practiced in 20 countries. I don't know whether CGIAR has been promoting it, is it?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Now, have they done any kind of report or study on their experiences across 20 countries?
I drew this from the case of Nepal. I'm sure there must be other comprehensive
it will be useful.
reports.
I mean, it could be a good takeaway from this particular session, among others. Over to you, Sudhi.
Yes. Thank you.
7 to 8 minutes.
Sure. I don't think I'll be taking that long. So I think thank you so much for giving me the platform. So like many countries, in South Asia, because Nepal is also at the forefront of climate change, right? But I'd like to carry on, build upon the concepts or issues highlighted by Dr. Armasinghe, right, from Sri Lanka. So we obviously, the traditional discourse on climate resilience has focused around helping farmers, right, deal with, mitigate and recover from and adapt to these climate shocks and stresses, right? But while these interventions at the farm level, the production level is very important, they are not enough, especially to build a resilient agriculture system. When you're talking about a system, because to really ensure food security, we need to move beyond just production, right? We have to cover the entire value chain, rightly mentioned by my colleagues earlier. This is because climate change is not only making it difficult to grow food, it's getting costly, and at the same time, it's also making it challenging to deliver food from farm to the consumers, which is the major challenge, farm to fork, right? Because with rising temperature, there is road disruptions, there is shocks and stresses that really hamper the efficient distribution of food at the time of need, and without efficient distribution systems, we cannot rely on a very, we cannot say that we are very resilient, right? No matter how much food we are growing, right? And I think, like earlier discussed, right? So the Global Food Security Index 2022 also highlights that affordability and food quality parameters have been declining globally and also in South Asia. That's where the concept of nutritional food security is also coming in, right? If you talk about Nepal, for fresh fruits and vegetables, which are very nutrition-dense commodities, right? The year-on-year price inflation was 23%, right? 23.11% in 2024, whereas the wages and the wages grew by only 6.5% and salary by just 1%. So you can imagine every year nutritious food is getting expensive. So in that context, how do we think about food security, right? Whereas then the new concept of obviously nutritional security coming into the picture, right? So obviously one overall strategy is to really reduce the cost of getting food to the table. Exactly. So supply is just not production, right? You can produce, but you have to get it to the table if you really want to address these challenges of food insecurity. And then this is where I like to introduce the concept of food loss, right? Which is not getting a lot of attention in COPE nor in many of the climate, mitigation strategies or adaptation strategies. If you look at average numbers in South Asia, in Nepal, it's estimated almost 40% of food that is grown, particularly fresh fruits, is lost. It doesn't even reach the consumers, let alone the waste that is happening once it gets to our table in restaurants. That's a whole another issue, right? Given this scale of a problem, how appropriate is it for us to, focus all our effort, money, resources, right, which are limited, obviously, like I mentioned in all the previous sessions, in a smaller basket of CSAs where you're focused on helping farmers produce more, right? So I think in India alone, right, the recent study conducted by WRI India estimates that in 2020 and 2021, 18.9 billion was the valuation in dollars for the economic loss of food loss and waste in India alone, right? So these are not just loss of economic waste, actually, you're wasting all the vital resources like land, water, labor, all the millions of dollars in investment, which obviously we cannot afford to squander given the immense challenge posed by climate change, And so, and also not to mention, obviously, food loss is a major contributor to climate change as well, with 8 to 9% contribution in the global GHG emissions. So we need to have this discussion where food loss is a part of a mitigation strategy and adaptation strategy as well, right? Because, and it's much needed, right? And so, yes. That as well, and so imagine, so it's in the case of Nepal, I'll give you a practical example, like if tomatoes, so there is an example, I think in Madhya Pradesh, recently conducted study. It says in Madhya Pradesh, which is the largest producer of tomatoes, within the state itself, right, annually 145,000 tons of tomato is lost from farm to the table, right? That it is estimated that 65 tons of CO2 is emitted. And this is because when you're at 65 tons, right, in one supply chain of tomatoes within one state in India, right? If you can multiply this across commodities, and tomato is among the less perishable commodities, right, compared to, let's say, green leafy vegetables. My colleague talked about iron deficiency, right? Green leafy vegetables intake need to be promoted in that regard. So these are some of these things, like, all these losses, just not just economic numbers, right? They are nutritional loss that could be actually food that could be fed to people to address these food security challenges. And so another thing is also, with food loss, there's inefficient in the system. That means it leads to higher prices, because once there is food loss and waste, the traders or the businesses, right, they transfer the cost onto the farmers and also onto the consumers. And that is why one of the reasons why we see higher, farmers not getting a bigger share of the retail price, whereas we consumers, we are always having to pay a higher price, because there is a loss inefficiency issue at play here, right? And that's something that we need to address, because when farmers, like I think in the earlier session, they were talking about how farmers in India are committing suicide, right? That's because they're not satisfied maybe with the income they are generating in most cases. It could be due to climate shocks, but it could also be due to market shocks, right? And in that context, expecting farmers to invest more in climate-resilient agriculture, which can be risky and also sometimes costly as well, without them feeling that they're getting a better deal, how does it make sense, right? How do we invest? Because how is it sustainable, right? We can fund them, sources, but ultimately resilience has to come from within, where farmers are investing, continued investment, right? So that's something that's again linked to food loss and waste. So I think it's time for us to, shift our focus from overproduction of food, because globally, they say that we are producing more than is needed to feed the population. But then we should focus on the distribution or the efficiency of supply chain or value chains, if you must. And I think even SDG target 12.3 talks about reducing food loss and waste by half. But unfortunately, I think apart from Sri Lanka, none of the South Asian countries have even committed to reducing food loss and waste, right? Let alone setting targets under the NDCs, which are again being revised currently, right? So without us, South Asian countries acknowledging the problem of food loss and waste, our government setting tangible targets to reduce them, right, which requires investment post-farm many of the times, right, where it's cold chain or logistics, packaging or any other technologies, right, digital technologies or innovations. How do we even confront this big problem of, building of climate resilient agriculture system, that too to address the growing food security. So I think, yeah, that is something I think we should all strive to do. And these kind of discussions here could, be slowly shift our focus to also focus on these core constraints in that we say, right, that food loss and waste is a win-win in all aspects, for food security, for climate mitigation, climate adaptation. So yeah, I hit my case here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudeep. Excellent. I think you made your points very, very forcefully. And food loss is certainly a very big problem. The problem with food loss often is, and by the way, Government of India is under the Niti Aayog is tracking every indicator of, including food loss. The problem is infrastructure, and the problem with infrastructure is money. It's not so much as the design or the availability of space to build it. You require road network, you require power networks, and cold stores, including cold storage transport vans also. So there's a lot of this happening in India, but on a very minimalistic basis. Much more is desirable. I agree with you that the food loss is still very high, 40%. Now, when you took the example of tomatoes in Madhya Pradesh, can you imagine that we had a crisis in tomatoes in India? And prices had gone through the roof. So there is, there's a question, there's an abundance somewhere, and there is a critical shortage somewhere else. And tomato is a very critical, essential vegetable or fruit. By the way, tomato is a fruit, it's not a vegetable. A lot of people think it is still a vegetable. But anyway, the point is that I'll add an example. In fact, we've done a study on APMC, the Agriculture Produce Marketing Cooperative Act, keeping tomato as the central theme, because that was the best possible way for. See, the issue is now many of these issues are very complex. In fact, in that East Africa, we did a long study supported by Sweden for nearly 8 years, and we looked at as to how farmers can adapt to climate change, and we came out with very good results. Not only that, we could get all the different ministries sitting on the same table, and talking about these issues commonly, and then they all realized the value of this kind of interministerial coordination on many of these issues which require interministerial approaches, policy directions, etc. Now, the problem still remains, how do we build resilient agriculture system, knowing that the climate change is going to happen, and it's going to continuously happen and the fact is that there would be downsides from the climate change. We heard about droughts and floods, which is happening, I think, throughout the South Asian region, including in Nepal and India. And it started happening in other parts of the world as well, including the developed world, by the way. A lot of people may not know, Spain had a very big sort of flood fury, I would say. So it's not a southern problem, it's a global problem. Having said that, this is the session that I spoke to with Ratnakar's moderation earlier, that you require, again, a multiple approach in order to deal with the sort of what is called the root problems. And unless you deal with the root problems, many of these issues that we're talking about, we will not be able to resolve them. Because they'll keep on suffering from the same kind of handicap or hurdles at the root. And unless you're able, For example, now you spoke about food wastage. Now, of course, we require infrastructure, and for infrastructure, we need money. So how do we deal with that? And that is where we spoke about climate finance being one of the essential elements of global cooperation which can help fund these kind of infrastructure projects at a low cost or zero cost to the country concerned, understanding that it will sort of help these. Well, one of the things which we didn't speak about, even in the earlier session or here, and which reflects food, is another population control. Nobody talks about population control. Unfortunately, population itself is a big problem. And it creates a, more demand of food, and more demand on infrastructure, more demand on facilities, etc. There is a discussion on that, but there again, I don't think we are making very good headway. Having said that, can I open the floor for questions, comments? Please do identify yourself. Microphone. It's being recorded.
Yes, very thought-provoking.
Your name, sir?
I am Badri Pastakoti. I work for the EU-funded Trade and Investment Program. So, yes, after listening all these discussions, input also on the ideas, I see very little discussion on the strategic focus of climate resilient agri system food security. How, strategic focus in the sense that, like talking about our own country case, we have mountain, hill, lowland. So mountain has mountain specificity. Similarly, hill has hill specificity. Lowland has lowland specificity. Around this, also we have regional specificity in SAARC or in global phenomena. So de-agrirization is another, which really, climate has triggered to a large extent. So most often than not, these issues are more science-led than other, like livelihood, household levels, agenda are less considered, and they are less in the center. So how this climate, because food security, first of all, at the household level, then it builds an end, then it becomes a national issue. So in my view, we have to have, like Nepal has National Adaptation Action Plan. Indeed, this is macro. But each geographical or agroecological region has their own specificity that has to deal with the, these microclimatic conditions, climate resilient issues. So this has not trickled down to that level to the extent we are envisaging. Like connectivity between one province, the other. Local adaptation plan is also there, but they are also like working in silo, as you mentioned. This kind of issues in future has to consider going beyond the science. We have to consider about social science. We have to consider about cultural science, like as you mentioned, from wheat to shifting from wheat to millet. How? This kind of strategic focus is rather lacking. Wherever I read the literature, maybe I'm not becoming cynical as such, but this is an issue which I have seen very little discussion, unless we discuss about all these issues. Also, you rightly mentioned about the coordination. I don't think coordination works at all. Why I am saying at all, it is a very strong word. We have seen coordination has failed. But to bring all the line agencies, etc., to be accountable, we have to have collaborative effort. Like agriculture and irrigation, they are not working together. Agriculture and the Ministry of Environment. But if we have a collaborative effort, maybe through co-funding, co-programming, co-planning, so that both work as two sides of the coin. This kind of thing only help securing the food
very good
at
point.
the household level.
Thank you. in the morning plenary, an issue was raised and reiterated by Ratnakar in his conclusion also, that we require to reinvent our institutions. Sir, we require to reinvent our institution. Institutions, it means a regime, not an organization, as a lot of people misunderstand it. The whole regime. Now, for example, if there are multiple ministries working on it, that's a part of an institution. And whether they follow an institutional approach or not is something which is still a big challenge. And that is something which we have to continue to work and remind everybody possible, not only the bureaucrats or the ministers, but also the people, that look, these are important issues and they have to be dealt with. But an example, as was quoted by Shalini in Nepal, I think is an excellent example of a bottom-up approach, this village smart park, climate smart villages. That, I think, is a very good example, and I hope we can find out more as to what is happening in other 19 countries. That would give us a good understanding as to how do we deal with that at the grassroots level at least. And many civil society organizations across the breadth and the width of the whole subcontinent can take this forward. A lot of things are already happening. It's not as if it's not happening. Yeah, no, I know. Yeah, you please, gentlemen.
Hi, it's me, Madan Adhikari from IIDS. I'm researcher at IIDS. So from the discussion, very insightful discussion, what we came to know is Nepal is highly vulnerable to climate change due to its diverse topography and reliance on the climate-sensitive sector like agriculture, which significantly contribute to national GDP. So increasing erratic weather pattern, rising temperature, glacial retreat, and extreme events like flood and droughts have disrupted the agriculture productivity and threatening the food security for millions. So in this context, my question is, how can climate-resilient agriculture system address the nutritional need of vulnerable population? Also, under the given condition of high poverty level and the low financial capacity of smallholder farmers to invest in adaptive measures, what are the cost implications of transitioning to a climate-resilient agriculture system? Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question here also.
Okay, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation by all the panelists. Myself, Dr. Srikumar Mahajan, and I'm working in the Collaborating for Resilience as a senior research analyst. My question,
where are you working?
Collaborating for Resilience. So the question, I have one question each for everyone, all the panelists. The first question goes to Matina Joshi Baidji. She has highlighted some of the issues related to climate, but what are the strategies and policies that is related to climate resilient agriculture that is efficient in terms of Nepal, that is initiated or being planned or being executed by Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Development? So we would like to know more about those. So I hope you will be highlighting.
Thank you very much.
And then second question is to Dr. Amara Singhe, because there are lots of issues related to agriculture because of the youth migration, and that is very prominent issue in Nepal. So I'm wondering, like, what is the situation in your country? Because youth are not really interested to do agriculture, and they often go to the foreign countries for study, and they don't want to go back to the roots, basically, to rural areas and do agriculture. Even in Nepalese context, most of the agriculture graduates usually go abroad. 60%, they don't want to do agriculture as agriculturist. So what is the situation in your country? So that is second question to our friends there, friends from Sri Lanka. And my question goes to Shalini, which is really good. You have highlighted some of the good cases, and especially the climate smart agriculture. But my question is, like, is it really efficient, the climate smart agriculture? Because some civil society organizations and CGIAR, they do this kind of intervention as one pilot, and they often, because they do in the small area, and then they consider it is efficient. But what about expansion of this? If that is really efficient, climate smart or climate resilient village, why not the government is taking over? So that kind of collaboration and then that kind of dialogue or advocacy with the government has it done, or what is the possibility of expansion of those kind of climate smart agriculture in other areas? Because it's very important in context of Nepal and other countries as well, because climate vulnerabilities and externalities have been increasing over the years. So we really need to expand that, not limiting in one area. We need to expand to other countries, other areas within the country. So what is the situation? And the last question, which is very interesting, and this is eye-opening for me, like food loss. So what is your organization's efforts and strategy to work with the government? Because this is a very serious issue, and not much of the organizations have focused on that. So what will be the strategy for your organizations to collaborate with the government and other public sector, basically? Because this is not only one organization like yours focusing on minimizing the food loss, and it needs to be the joint initiatives with the government and private sectors. And also, what is your strategy? Thank you. And one more is, like, we often talk about food security, but nowadays we have been talking about food sovereignty, and our previous friend also raised about cultural issues and other issues. So why not to talk about food sovereignty? So this goes to all the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a related one. The moderator will come to you. So just one point that is related to your intervention, and just wanted to chip in there. What is the role of the private sector to prevent food loss? Because there is a role. That we have not yet recognized. Of course, private sectors are driven by incentives. Maybe there's not enough incentive for them to invest. Actually, for example, setting up a kind of a processing plant for, this tomato or whatever is going to rot, they can package it, process, package, and then, sell it in the supermarket, and they last for a year or two, actually. So, in the frozen form or in a kind of a packaged form.
Tomato puri.
Tomato puree, yes. And whatever. Many countries, I work with the EIF, in the Enhanced Integrated Framework. So what we've done, one example, Pradeep, if I may, is the government of Mali, they received a support from us for the production of mango. In order to increase the productivity, they were able to increase the productivity, and as a result of which, productivity was increased so much that there was a glut in the market, right? So, and they didn't know what to do, and they would also throw on the street. So somehow we managed to rope in the government of Netherlands to help them to set up a processing facility. Now that processing facility is in place, and this has been in place for the last 10 years, and what they have done is to process these, mango which would have otherwise rotten into dried mangoes and mango jams. And now they are exporting those mangoes to Luxembourg, France, and Belgium. And that's a great source of income and livelihood opportunity for these farmers. So, regardless, in the context of climate change or otherwise, those possibilities.
And you save food waste.
Yeah. Right. So that's something I think, it's a kind of a public intervention because we were involved. But, private sector can also be involved in such kind of initiatives. So why not? I think, Sudeep, you represent the private sector, right, these days. Sudeep used to work with Soti. So now he has become an entrepreneur. So he might have some ideas to share.
Good. Anyway, let me start with Dr. Joshi.
Pradeep, there's one more question out there.
Okay, I'll come back.
Let
the panel respond to these questions. And maybe their response might give you some answers.
Yes, thank you, Professor, and thank you for the queries. I think that most of the things that you have raised is rightly point out that what Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Development is doing on climate resilient part is that the Nepal government has, recently 16th plan is in, also climate change is addressed there. And in the 15th plan also climate resilience system development has been mentioned there. And we have been working with the different strategies like adopting climate resilient agriculture practices. And the NARC has, NARC, which is a Nepal Agricultural Research Council for Nepal, has developed some of the paddy which are resistant to drought, like Sukha 1, 2, 3, and the other bits also, they are trying to develop these things, and has been, the technology has been transferred to farmers as well. And also the use of the technology and digital technology has been used for the precision agriculture things, like the forecasting, weather forecasting, because these days, because of the satellite system, it is very much accurate. And last September's, that the flooding was already, government has announced it beforehand, but still, we, farmers are not very much aware about these things. So a lot of awareness are needed, because the farmers are not getting the information correctly. So we are also developing the software in collaboration with Department of Hydrology regarding the forecasting, climate forecasting tools. So they get the on-time information, and if for example, if the temperature rise up, then what kind of pests they can proliferate, and also flooding, and they can take the precautions about it. And yes, I have mentioned about the drought resistance crops has been developed mostly by NARC, and also the use of the water management system, such as drip irrigation and the other irrigation systems, small irrigation
Sprinkler
system.
irrigation.
Yes, mostly drip irrigation is very much popular in
Yeah.
Nepal as well, because the high
Highly
areas.
efficient and productive.
Yes. And the soil health monitoring, we have a digital soil map has been developed, and it is used, can be used.
Can I ask you a question while you?
Yes.
You spoke about development of drought resistance crops.
Yes.
How do they respond to floods?
I can't answer you exactly, because
it's a
some
paradox.
part of the Nepal,
It's a paradox, depending on whether that
Yes.
region has both drought and floods.
Yes, because if you look at the geographical condition of the Nepal, we have a high hill, mountain, high hill, and then lowland. So some part are prone to flooding, but most of the part are drought. We don't have an irrigation system all over. Only about the 34% of the land, agriculture arable land, are covered with the irrigation. So this is very much important. So
Thank you.
yes.
Can we move on?
Yes. So early warning systems software we have been developing, and
No, you answer the question.
yes. So what was another concern about the food sovereignty? Yes,
Yeah,
I think
food sovereignty, yeah.
Yes. Food right to food and the Food Sovereignty Act was developed, was promulgated 5-6 years back, and now the regulation for the right to food and food sovereignty regulation is in place, and the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Development is responsible for implementation of this act. So this act and regulation has clearly mentioned about what is the right of the people, right to have the food they need for their cultural values, and the locally available foods has to be utilized, and the right of the farmers, and all these are legal thing are in place. So in that sense, we can say that we are good in these things, but it has to be implemented. We are still in process.
Yeah, the problem
to
with
develop.
most policies in any country, particularly in southern countries, there are three problems in policies: implementation, implementation, and implementation. Over to you, Polasi.
Yeah, so let me first take on the question on migration and how that has an effect. So migration in our country, there's been an increase since the economic crisis, but it's most focused on the IT and the skilled labor. But lately, there's an IPS study that's kind of trying to figure out whether that has an effect when it comes to certain, important actors within the value chain, not necessarily the producers, but there's some, talk about basically certain actors within, collectors of coconuts, these agents, moving outside of the country. So, of course, that's not the main reason why there's 400% increase in the coconut price over the past 12 months. But there's still not enough evidence to say that the agriculture sector is directly being affected, because the small scale farmers are unlikely to move out to different areas of the country or outside of the country. When it comes to private sector, bringing in private sector, so there have been some successful models in Sri Lanka, certainly with certain food chains, supermarket chains. Because remember, Sri Lanka is a quite small country compared to India. So we have had major food supermarket chains called Keels. They come into these informal agreements with farmers. So of course it's difficult to come into formal agreement with farmers because there's a lot of information asymmetry. Farmers selling to others, so it's difficult to come to these formal contracts with farmers in that regard. But they have managed to come up with these informal agreements where they, for example, buy 50% of what they produce, the 50% of the others they can sell to someone else. So there's of course farmers some sort of security as well, income security, which is also a key part of making climate systems, agricultural systems more resilient, right? So there have been some experiments with these supermarket chains, not just Keels. There are multiple. Some of the bigger chains have been successful, but the effect's quite small in terms of the reach, in terms of the number of farmers they can do this with. It's mostly in this 10-kilometer radius around their storage facilities that they are able to have this sort of these sort of contracts. So it'll be good to see if we can bring in more similar contracts in other areas as well. And when it comes to the strategic focus, one thing I want to mention is the governance. There needs to be some sort of flexibility in the governance as well, right? So one example we have in Sri Lanka right now is we have a new government. So for the first time, they have bundled the food security and the trade sections into one, or basically given to one minister. And he's actively working with the agriculture minister and the researchers, even us, because I've had recent experience in actually getting data, which was quite difficult with previous governments. So they have, it's good to see that there is some flexibility in that front. There is some sort of change in that front in terms of the mindset. But of course, it's yet to be seen if this is, this is still part of the honeymoon period, if it'll continue in like 3 months. So at least for the next 3 months, we'll try to make use of it. But the thing is, the mindset change, this is a government that was quite previously very opposed to imports when it comes to food security, rice imports. But now that they are in power, they are importing rice from India. So whether it's because they won the election or not, but whatever the case, the flexibility when it comes to governance is quite an important factor when it comes to coordination. Yeah.
Thank you, Shalini. Just a minute. Tulasi, one question about food sovereignty, which was asked to all the panel. Do you have any response to that?
So, so that is a bit of, I would say from a governing perspective, that's something that most governments would say that is their target. But of course, it's a bit of a difficult task because there are multiple dimensions of food sovereignty, or in terms of there are so many actors, so a lot to be done in terms of infrastructure. While it seems like a long-term target, at the moment, at least in Sri Lanka.
Thank you. Can you please define food sovereignty the way you think it is, so that the panel can respond to you more intelligently?
Yeah, so in food security, we are often talking about affordability, accessibility, and availability and utilization. But in sovereignty, we have been talking about distribution, as he mentioned, and also considering the cultural aspect, cultural and then indigenous aspect, because whenever we say food, food is associated with culture. So that part is often lacking whenever we say food security. But the cultural part, like for example, there are a number of indigenous people living in Nepal, and whenever they say food, like for example, you have heard about Newar, for example. Newar, their food system, their food cuisine is often related to culture.
Often?
So related with their culture. So that part, food is related to cultures. That part is often lacking.
Can you give an example?
I just mentioned about Newar group. Whenever we say Newar, Newar is one of the indigenous group here in Nepal, and we often have this food, which is called like food used for different culture, different festivals. We use different kind of food items. So that part is often lacking, and it is somehow related because whenever we say like feast in Newar, then these are the food items that is required. And that part is often lacking in food security. I mean, food security discussions and all.
Yeah, Shalini?
I'd like to start with the question about like what are the motivations for farmers to adapt climate smart practices, or like what incentives are there? So I would like to give like 2 examples of what the government has been trying to do and how that has played out, given how the market is working. So in Nepal's Karnali province, which is in the far west, post-federalism, they tried to introduce this brand for organic production called Mulyavan, where they would certify the organic produce. However, when we were in discussions there, we found that there were many challenges. There were no product and price differentiation based on organic production, and organic inputs such as biofertilizers and biopesticides were unavailable, and the markets were flooded with informally imported, adulterated and contaminated seeds. And very important issue was the lack of extension support for climate smart agriculture practices. So the ratio is like 1:1,500. Like for one extension agent, they have to cater to around 1,500 farmers. So there's a lot of gap in that kind of support. And although small efforts are taking place, but the market is still not ready to actually give place to like organic production. Another thing was like Nepal adopted this good agriculture practices directives in 2018, where like these are considered to like the gap standards and regulations. If adopted by smallholders, they can potentially increase the farmers' access to both national and international markets if they could get the gap certification. However, the implementation and certification process has not been very successful. So these 2 examples, I just wanted to give like what attempts have been made for this sector. And responding to the question about climate smart villages and how much the government has taken up. So, so from what I could gather reading the documents, the government, especially in Sudur Paschim, Lumbini and Gandaki provinces, they've taken up this climate smart village approach in their policies itself, and they've been working on it. There are around 200 climate smart villages that are functional, and even in Nepal's nationally determined contributions, there are targets that by 2030 to establish like 500 climate smart farms and 200 climate smart villages. So these are the targets that I could find in our documents. So this is very much taken up by the government. Yeah, I'd stop there.
Thank you. Shalini,
thank you.
The last word to you.
Sure. Thank you so much for very interesting questions. So firstly, I think with regard to talking about local or household security, and also something related to food sovereignty, right? So any policies or any initiatives taken by government or non-profit organization, donor organization, need to consider the market dynamics, how markets function, right? Because markets, like you mentioned, localized markets are different, right? So you can produce one, so I'll give you a practical example. I think a couple of years back, NAC developed a wheat variety that was drought tolerant, right? and it won global recognition. When they tried to promote it on the ground, farmers did not adopt it. And one of the reasons was when you milled it, how did you eat the roti? You make roti. It didn't have the glutency or the consistency. It wasn't good for roti. It was very good in terms of climate resilience, right? But the market, there's no market uptake. So that's like the gap in research. In our initiative is we do the research from one end, one lens, but ultimately it's the consumption, right? That's the whole chain, and that's why I keep focusing on the chain, because anything in isolation does not work, because ultimately market drives consumer behavior. So that's something that to think about anytime you're making even localized decisions. You need to consider the market in that particular context. With regard to questions about how my organization, I represent Mandala AgriFetch. We are the only organization in Nepal working in food loss mitigation, right? So our priority is to mitigate food. We are a technology company. We provide access to technologies, consulting, and market for farmers as well who adopt improved practices. So the way we have, for the past 4 years, we have been trying to drive this agenda of food loss and waste, or post-harvest loss management. In Nepal, we'll find no data. Nobody wants to acknowledge that there is food loss and waste. My company tracks data. Within our company, we realize that in each value chain, there is 40, 50, 60% losses. Again, these are all contextual depending on the climate, the timing, and the destination from which food is procured. So right now, what we are doing is finally trying to work in the apple value chain. We believe in bundling of innovations. So we take a very holistic approach, and we say, okay, from post-farm production, what are the various practices, innovations that can sort of make sure that apples from, let's say, Jumla can get to Kathmandu and still be quality maintained, so that consumers are willing to pay that additional price for, say, organic gap, whatever you might say, right? It all depends on the payment willingness of the consumers. So we take that aspect, and we have been trying to work with a lot of innovation labs under the FTF, USAID Feed the Future initiative. They have been kind enough to sort of encourage us in this agenda. So we've been developing this, and recently, I think hopefully by next year, we'll be conducting the first food loss assessment of apples from Jumla. Hopefully that will be on the table. I think once that kind of data is going to come, then policy initiatives can be initiated in terms of determining NDCs, for example, right? Because nobody is focusing on food loss and waste, it's very easy to ignore, right? Because it's not very tangible, you don't see it very easily, it's difficult to measure, and you can always, it's contextual. So that's one way. And so right now we have been working quite rigorously with the government to push this agenda, and working with NARC and other research organizations to validate some of the technologies that we have introduced in the market, mostly surrounding packaging, so improve packaging practices. And there's also a lot of innovations happening in post-harvest management in India as well, with very low-cost organic synthetic compounds that can actually reduce spoilage. And this is very technical. I'm getting technical, but there are some innovations happening which do not require very significant infrastructural investments. And finally, to the point raised by Dr. Adhikari with regard to the processing facility in Nepal, various organizations, so the private sector is trying to get into processing. And one of the primary reasons or the constraints that it has failed so far is because we do not, at least I think it's the same in many South Asian countries, right? In Nepal in particular, we do not see farmers as businesses, right? Farmers as farmers, they're not part of the private sector. Every time we alienate farmers and private sector, but they're actually part of the private sector, right? So what that has led to is that even though there are instances where private sector has agreed upon with contracts to farmers, and we don't have a very good contractual contract farming laws in Nepal, but still local governments have initiated these these MOUs and contracts, and every time the farmer breaches the contract, there is no repercussion, right? So I can give you multiple examples where private sector have invested a lot of money giving seeds, input to farmers, and then obviously there is some shock in the market, or the prices increase a little bit, and then just farmers, everybody just side sells, right? So and the private company is left with nothing. And that is the reason why most private companies in Nepal find it easier to source from India, for example. They're binded by contract, right? So the price is fixed, the volume is fixed, they know it's coming. And from a private sector perspective, everything is about efficiency. The private sector doesn't do anything that is not efficient for their business. So if it's very costly for you to work with farmers and you cannot trust them because they're not held accountable, there is no point working with them. They would rather go with a supplier anywhere in the world who can meet their demand. And so that's kind of the systemic challenges that we are facing. I think that's where much work needs to be done.
Thank you very much. Now with that, we come to a conclusion. It's 1 o'clock, and we have another meeting to go to. There's an excellent discussion, and I think I had, and like many of you would have learned many new things. The fact is that it is a very complex situation. It requires, it's like a chessboard. You have to play with several pieces on the chessboard in order to be able to think about food security and, more importantly, nutrition security, as has been pointed out by some of my panelists here. It's not sufficient to have quantity of food, but also the quality of food and the right kind of food, as we spoke about. Now, the fact is that we are going to continue, as Martina pointed out, we are going to continue to face these climate change variables over times to come. And then how do we design our agricultural systems to be able to cope with it? And that will require a lot of thinking and understanding by the government, and to work with the farmers as well as intermediate organizations, so that there is as was pointed out, there is a need for a very clear strategic policy strategy to be adopted at every country level in order to deal with this kind of problem, rather than to continuously talk about, the various chess pieces that there are on the board. We have to look at the whole thing as. And now, the other good thing, which another important takeaway which came up, was climate smart villages, and that has to be studied in order to see whether and a suggestion was made by somebody that let government take it up and move it forward. Keep the government out, and that is how it will succeed. The moment you bring in government, then you've had it. I'll give you an example. India is very good in the technology sector. You know why? Because the government was not involved with it. It's just totally private sector-led growth. And by the way, Sudeep, farmers are the biggest private sector in the world, except in USA, where of course corporate sector has overtaken the farmers also. The fact is that let's not forget that the farmers are the biggest private sector, and they are certainly dependent upon government doles in many countries. In India, of course, there's a very big sort of conflict going on getting a minimum support price. Some of the farmers lobbies, not all of them, want a guaranteed, legally enshrined minimum support price, which is very difficult for government of India to agree to. Having said that, now again on governance issues, I think we spoke about governance issues. Other than the fact is that you require a clear strategy, and that is what each country should work upon. I belong to a landlocked state, Rajasthan, and we have, like Nepal, we have our own problems, which are different than the rest of India. I mean, India, as you know, it's such a different country in different regions that we cannot compare ourselves with Tamil Nadu, for example. Nothing is similar here. And on the other hand, Ratnakar, we are now facing the third environmental issue, desertification, which is a problem in Rajasthan and in Sindh across the border, because we have the same desert. And these are the things that we have to look at in the context of the whole environmental calculus. These are issues which are now only getting worse. Deserts are expanding. And how do we stop that? Because again, there again, agriculture is very important. Fortunately, due to our ancient wisdom, we have a lot of resilient crops which grow in desert areas, like guar gum or kikar, and there are so many plants which grow without any water at all. And that is something which we need to understand as to how do we, how we can exchange more knowledge about it, particularly because there are many areas in this subcontinent which could turn into, drought-prone and desert or arid zones, and therefore the kind of knowledge which you can get from states like Rajasthan would be very useful in order to deal with this kind of problems. With that, let me thank you all once again, and an excellent audience. I'm sorry that some of the questions which we could not take, but you could discuss it with the panelists at the lunchtime. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep sir. So we have had a truly enlightening and encouraging discussion, productive actually, discussion on the session, Climate Resilient Agri-System for Food Security. I would like to thank our moderator, Mr. Pradeep Singh Mehta for the excellent moderation, for your support. Thank you very much. I would also like to thank all the panelists